Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
I'm Shahar Azani, and as always, it is a pleasure to join the wonderful David Harris on Defending Israel. Israel continues to fight Hamas in Gaza as US elections are looming near, including recent elections in the UK and France that have kind of rattled the continent. How would these affect Israel and indeed Jews worldwide? David, so thrilled to be with you as always. How have you been?
Other than the crises, absolutely fine.
Exactly. Well, you know, you're mentioning crises and crises in general. This week we're marking 9 months since the beginning of this atrocious war, beginning with the unforgettable forever, the massacre of October 7th. Describe your sentiment at this point in time. How do you see the war? How do you see where we are strategically, diplomatically, the world? Anything you want to share with us at this moment? Because 9 months is quite the time.
I think I'll pick up on one word you said, Shahar. You said unforgettable. Because I fear that it's not necessarily the right word for many people around the world. It's certainly been quite forgettable for a number of people. They've long since forgotten how this began.
Right.
They talk about the Israeli invasion of Gaza.
Yeah.
Through very malicious use of words, they've turned the whole story around. In fact, there's a term for this in the English language. I'm not sure how many viewers know this. It's called reverse causality. So Hamas starts a war, a genocidal war, and all of a sudden the world's attention is not focused on the perpetrator,
Right.
but on the respondent. And the perpetrator is not being judged or assessed or accused or challenged. It's the response. And I keep saying this, but I feel I need to repeat it. In American demographic terms, 1,200 people killed on October 7th is 42,000 people. And 240 people kidnapped is
yeah.
over 8,000. Now, I ask you, Shahar, I ask the viewers, I ask all of those troublesome players out there, like the government of Ireland, and the government of Spain, and the government of Norway, and the government of South Africa, and Turkey, and Brazil, if in proportional terms, your countries were attacked, and thousands upon thousands of people were killed, and many more abducted, what would you do? Well, we know what the United States would do because we had two situations. We had Pearl Harbor and we had 9/11. Pearl Harbor, the death toll was about 3,000. 9/11, the death toll was again about 3,000. No one kidnapped. We went to war in both cases. The United States of America went to war against Imperial Japan. We went to war against Al-Qaeda, against Afghanistan, against Iraq. These were prolonged wars. But Israel is the only country on earth, it seems, that is not permitted to fully defend itself, much less complete a war, or shall we say, win a war.
Right.
So everyone goes into high gear. All the erudite diplomats go into high gear from day one. They invoke terms like international humanitarian law, right, and proportionality,
right,
and ceasefire, without any reference to what happened.
Right.
And with a failure to understand who and what Hamas is. Let me just give you one more example. I was in Greece until...
Well, before you touch on Greece, let me just, I want to hear more specifically about
No, because
Greece.
it's relevant, but go ahead.
But I just want to ask you, you're mentioning the kidnap. 240, 8,000, 120, 4,000 still held in captivity, including young Kfir Bibas. And a few days ago, the abominable Roger Waters gives an interview to Piers Morgan, completely delusional. But it just goes to show you the Holocaust denial of it, only 9 months after the fact. Only 9 months, David. Holocaust denial.
Denial about the murders, about the kidnappings, about the rapes.
Right.
These are disputes.
Right.
And in the language of today, you have your narrative,
Yeah.
I have mine. You have your history, I have mine.
Right.
You have your facts, I have mine. So, facts. I just came actually last night,
Right.
the night before we record.
Right.
I came back from Greece. I was at a major conference organized by The Economist magazine.
Right.
And
Very
one of the
prestigious
speakers,
magazine that most of our viewers must know.
and one of the speakers was Abdullah Gül, who was the former foreign minister and then president of Turkey.
Right.
Before Erdogan was president, Gül was president.
Right, I remember.
He stood up there on the stage and he said, that's why I have this piece of paper, the reason for this war is occupation. This was the brilliant analysis of the former president of Turkey and someone who's still a player in Ankara. He said it didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
It's occupation. So
Well, you do remember that it wasn't but a few weeks after the massacre that there was another president who evoked the context issue, former President Barack Obama, who, relating to the massacre, said this did not happen in a void, we have to remember the context, as was echoed later by Gutierrez and others. So we're seeing
very
that.
much so. So when you ask me how do I feel after 9 months,
Right?
I feel anger from head to toe.
Yeah.
But I also understand that anger may be an emotion, but it has to be channeled constructively.
Right.
And so, like you, like many others, I've been trying to channel it constructively, understanding that this is an existential conflict for Israel, that Israel must win and must have its deterrence restored if there's to be any prospect of, by the way, further normalization deals,
Right.
any prospect for calming the situation, at least temporarily. So trying to stay very much engaged, of course, and also understanding that Israel needs support. And all of these people I meet, some of them are well-intentioned, Shahar, to be fair, who are all second-guessing. From thousands of miles away, they're second-guessing. They're armchair generals. They're armchair intelligence analysts. They're armchair political leaders. I'm not second-guessing. People can watch me from October the 7th. I'm not second-guessing. There are others who have to make the decisions and live with the consequences. I believe that my job is to support Israel as much as I can and to help others understand why Israel is not just a case for me as a Jew, it's also a case for me as a proud member of the West.
Right.
The West.
You know, you're mentioning Greece, and we're so fortunate that we had you present, and not just present, but actually a speaker in a very prestigious forum, the only one speaking up for Israel and the Jewish people in that forum. And I want to ask you, you mentioned Abdullah Gül. We remember Gül, we remember his roles, you know, we think Turkey, Erdogan, there are other forces. What was the general sentiment when it comes to Israel and the war against Hamas savages in Gaza at the moment among your peers, those who, you know, other speakers, attendees, you know, at the very top level of international diplomacy and punditry? What was your sense of this international sentiment?
Well, what I can tell you is this. I was the only one. There were 1,900 participants. There were over 100 speakers over three and a half days. I was the only one who had the opportunity to speak about these issues and try and frame them and respond to people like Abdullah Gül.
Right.
I was very pleasantly surprised, I have to tell you, by the reaction afterwards. The number of people who came up to me, either in the conference hall or in the hallways or at a meal, sometimes almost whispering, as if it couldn't be said too loud.
That's true.
And these were these were non-Jews.
Yeah.
These were largely people from the Balkans, from the Eastern Med, and they would whisper to me, "I'm with you. I agree with you, 100%. We have to stand together."
Right.
And that was, I have to tell you, very pleasantly surprising, because I've been to a lot of conferences, and unless you're a rock star, people don't sort of show up.
Right.
Here they did, and yet most of them, I think, felt somewhat uncomfortable saying it too loudly. And then along came one more discordant note. The leader of the opposition, there was a dinner with the Greek Prime Minister, who did not speak about the conflict at all, but has been a friend of Israel, Prime Minister Mitsotakis. Then, as is always the custom, the next night they had the leader of the opposition, the leader of Syriza, it's a far left party. And I have to tell you, he raised this issue.
He did.
And it was awful. It was awful. You would never know. You would never know there was an invasion on October 7th. You would never know that there were hostages taken. You would never know that there were families in Israel that are completely destroyed because of the hostages. And
families completely eradicated at the massacre.
And he himself went to the region as the leader of Syriza. And all he spoke about was the other side, the tragedy, the calamity, the destruction. And then he added a gratuitous note, sort of he wandered off in other directions, and he said, when asked about the American election, he said, "I love President Biden. I volunteered for him years ago. He actually lived in America for some years." And he went on about President Biden, making clear that that was his choice. And then he added, completely unprompted, "But I disagree with him on one issue, Gaza." So this kind of need to put it out there, to make sure that everyone heard it not once, but twice.
Right. Virtue signaling to the core.
So he has his equivalents in France, if we're going to talk about the election.
But I'm thinking about those changes in Europe, because to my mind, if you remember right at the beginning, a few weeks into the massacre, you saw international high-level visits in Israel. I remember Rishi Sunak, the British premier. I remember President Macron coming to Israel. And then
Mitsotakis was, I think, the Greek prime minister.
And lucky he's still in place, but yet in the UK, that's not the case anymore. In France, that's not the case anymore. We're hearing Mélenchon, head of the far left right, who didn't even acknowledge, the massacre, who didn't acknowledge the anti-Semitism. How do you see these developments in Europe, in the UK, in France? Are you surprised?
I have to say one thing that's sort of off topic.
Yeah.
I envy the UK in one respect.
Okay.
They call an election 6 weeks ahead. 6 weeks pass. They have the election. The results are known, and the next day, whoever wins takes over.
Right.
Compare that to the mishugas we have in the United States.
Right.
Presidential elections that go on for years.
Right.
Even when they're finally decided November, and we have another 2.5 months. So that's the only thing that I want to say.
Yeah.
But otherwise, look, we've had several political earthquakes, one after another, and we all need time to process them, to understand them, to analyze them. The first one was the European Parliament elections.
Right.
Now, many Americans don't necessarily understand. Because of the European Union, there were 3 bodies, as there are in the US as well. You have the European Parliament, which is not the national parliament of Germany or France or Italy. It's a separate body entirely. Right. So there you had considerable voting for the far right. Then you had the elections in Britain, where the Conservative Party was ousted. I mean, landslide. And the elections in France, round 2.
So in the UK, when the Conservative Party was ousted, does that mean that it was the opposite of what happened in the European Parliament when it comes to right and left? Or what to your understanding happened?
I think it's more complicated as well.
More internal
and a lot
issues.
of these elections are about internal issues.
That's true.
The Conservatives...
And very regional.
They've been ruling, I think, for 13 consecutive years.
True. Right.
There's always going to be an incumbent fatigue.
That's true. Aside from... Maybe.
So, So at this point, after 13 years, the conservatives have run out of excuses
Right.
for whatever voters are unhappy about.
But you know what struck me in the UK elections was that video that went viral of the 5 independents in the UK
Right.
who ran and won based on one agenda item, that was Gaza, including the swords dance in Birmingham. I mean,
But look, we have to understand that in any democracy, the pendulum swings.
yeah, that's true.
And that's why it's so important for the pro-Israel community to have deep roots in all the major parties.
Very important point.
And to anticipate
Right, change.
the swings, because they come. They
Right.
come.
Right.
And this has been one of my consistent messages, not just on this program, Shahar, but in my entire career.
Right.
You may like the Democrats, you may like the Republicans, your business.
Right.
But for those of you who care about the U.S.-Israel relationship, you got to look farther and wider.
Right.
Because the
It
pendulum
can't be a
swings.
one-party issue, that's true.
So after 13 years, if you don't like medical care in Britain, if you don't like food prices, if you don't like gasoline prices, if you don't like your taxes, you're going to blame the people in power.
Right.
Because who else can you blame? So they're out. Now we see Keir Starmer represents the more moderate wing of the British Labour Party.
Right, famously cleansing it of Corbyn's anti-Semitism.
Right. Now, the big question is, how deep is the cleansing? And to what degree does he still feel an obligation to the left wing of the party?
Right.
Which is pretty hardcore left.
That's true.
I think Keir Starmer is very much mainstream. He's already reached out in a number of directions. He's in Washington this week for the NATO summit. He'll have a round of meetings. He's a very recognizable figure in the sense of his political views. The concern is not with him so much.
Correct.
The concern is with the dynamics within the party,
Right.
and who's going to be in charge. And for us, especially when it comes to Israel,
Very true.
when it comes to weapon sales,
Right.
when it comes to voting in the UN Security Council, where
Right.
Britain has a veto power,
Right.
not to mention the General Assembly.
Right. When it comes to how it treats, the criminal court in The Hague.
Exactly. So there are a whole list of things where we need
Correct.
to be watching
Right.
to see to what degree is Keir Starmer in charge, and to what degree is he actually the moderate that we all want to believe
Correct.
he is. France is more complicated.
Right.
More complicated because we don't have an outcome. We don't have a new prime minister and new government. We don't know whether we'll have it tomorrow or in 3 months. And we don't know, even if we do, exactly what it's going to look like and how much it reflects the hardcore left, which, as all the news reports said, surprised everyone by beating the hardcore right.
Right, and what a moment it is to be a Jew in France, right? When the chief rabbi of France is calling upon Jews to move away, when Jews in France have already been suffering incredible anti-Semitism for decades now, and now they have to go in between the far right, supposedly, or Mélenchon, whose approach vis-a-vis Jews is well known. We saw the riots in Paris, immediately when the results
The
were
riots
announced.
when they win,
Yeah.
by the way, and had they lost,
Right.
the riots,
The riots when they lose.
Same people
Right.
and same rioting.
So we go back to the importance of Israel, David.
Well, I just want to add for JBS viewers
Yeah.
that on the 24th of July, which is 2 weeks from when we're recording, I will have as my guest on this show the president of the Jewish community of France, Jonathan Arfi. And people need to watch that because he'll be able
Sure.
by then to give us a much deeper analysis. Right now we're in the moment. It's too
Right.
soon. We're too close.
Right.
But the fact that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, this firebrand far left, I mean, one can't say it strongly enough, Shahar, far left, many say deeply anti-Semitic,
Right.
hostile to Israel, and very much in bed with Islamists. I'm not saying Muslims, I'm saying
Right.
Islamists.
Yep.
The hardcore.
Hardcore.
The hardcore is reason for worry because Mélenchon sees himself as a victor here,
Right.
and is going to be demanding, his pound of flesh.
And we expect, that vision of him is also reflected in the media. And as we all know, in every war, in every struggle, in every political or whether military, perception is everything.
Perception is everything. So, here I come down to, I don't mean to get ahead of your question, but we're living in an extraordinarily dangerous world. I mean, one can say that at almost any time, but this is a particularly dangerous time. So what happens in the United States and what happens in the American elections has real consequences, more than usual, if I can put it that way, Shahar. And that's why we need to pay a lot of attention to what's happening right here, because without American leadership, how we deal with a resurgent Russia, a resurgent China, a confident Iran, an irresponsible North Korea, how we deal with those kind of mid-size actors, state and non-state actors, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and then countries like Turkey, complicated countries like Turkey, all matters. Without the US, the world is going to go in a very dangerous direction fast.
And I think, to be honest, we're seeing that deterioration when it comes to our region and other places. There is a sense, there is that sense of out of control. There is that sense of violence erupting everywhere. We're seeing Hezbollah daring more and more. We're seeing Iran daring more and more. We haven't even mentioned the advancement of the nuclear program. I mean, there are significant challenges for any administration.
Think they can strike shipping with impunity. So, I've been a nonpartisan my whole career. That's 50 years now. I've said on this show before, even my wonderful mother never knew how I voted because of what we said earlier. I believe that the pro-Israel community must have deep roots in both parties, but I'm worried. I'm worried about perceptions around the world. I'm worried about the perception of the arrogance of one presidential candidate and the frailty of another presidential candidate here. And it's not for me to evaluate the truth of the arrogance or the frailty. It's simply to say, as a lifelong student of diplomatic history, international relations, global security, those perceptions can create enormous challenges for the United States.
We're mentioning challenges. I want to talk for a minute about one of the things I love the most with you, which is the practicalities of all that you say. What would you tell our viewers? What can we do? What would you recommend how should we act in response to these challenges, whether it's the good, bad list, or whether it's activism, or how do you see us taking part or actually implementing all of the important things that you're telling us today?
I just want to add one more thing, if I may, Shahar, to the last point. I'll go so far as to say this about the American election, and I'm sure there'll be those who don't agree with me. Fine. I'm hoping for two particular outcomes. Outcome number one, whoever wins decisively. That the other side cannot dispute it, cannot challenge it in the courts, cannot take it to the Supreme Court, cannot tie up the country. That's number one. And number two, I'm actually hoping for a split vote. I'm hoping that if one party wins the White House, the other party will win at least one of the two houses of Congress. And I understand it's a formula for paralysis or even dysfunction, but we have within both parties extremist elements pulling in this direction and in this. And the only way I see to contain rational policy making, not to mention to try and keep this country whole, is through divided government, that each is a check on the other within the houses of Congress. As far as what people can do, well, I will tell you this very proudly. One of my sons returned yesterday, as I returned from Greece with my wife. He returned from Israel. He was a volunteer. He took time away from his family, from a very demanding job, and he was picking fruit in very hot temperatures. And as he told me, Dad, every morning I got up early, I went to the bus, The bus was full of volunteers, Jews, non-Jews, people from all over the world. We were picking the fruits day after day, and there were other volunteers going in other directions. My daughter-in-law's mother recently went from Canada, her home, and volunteered on a military base and was packing medical supplies for the medics while living in a double-decker bed and with the outhouse, God knows where, from the barracks. Right. And she's a grandmother. So one obvious answer is travel to Israel. The planes are full. You'll be in good company. Volunteer. Do something. Help out somewhere. Offer something.
Right.
Number one. Number two, I've been invited to a number of people's living rooms. People who want to invite their friends and family, come together, let's talk about this. And the invitations always say to the people, bring your tough questions.
Yep.
We want to talk about Israel. Yes, we're pro-Israel, but
right. Bring
your toughest questions and let's discuss them and how to respond to them.
Right.
So open your home. Watch more JBS. I mean, you want tourists? Watch some other channels.
Right.
You want nachas? You want to be informed about events, not through the slant of the media? Watch JBS. Thank God for JBS. Talk to your children. Don't hide your children, especially high school and college-age children. Don't come up with notions like, well, they'll figure it out for themselves when they're older, or I don't want to influence them. Of course you want to influence them.
Of course.
I mean, there are certain things that are precious for us. One of them should be our Jewish pride and identity, Shahar. And one of them should be our love for Israel and our gratitude that in our lifetimes, Israel lives.
Agreed.
Israel lives. So there are lots of things. And of course, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Don't give your votes away. We're approaching that season, whether it's primary or whether it's the general election in November. Candidates want your vote. They want your support. They want your endorsement. Make sure they understand there's a price. The other side has made clear there's a price.
Very clear.
In France, they made clear. In Britain, they made clear. In Michigan, they're making clear, and elsewhere. They're saying, you want our vote? We want to hear you talk about Gaza, 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 right. Gaza, and genocide, genocide, starvation, blah, 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 though none of it is true. What are we saying? Are we tongue-tied?
Right.
Are we shy?
Right.
I say with pride, I feel I'm among the luckiest people in the world. 75 generations of Jews yearned for a Jewish state and never lived to see it. And I'm part of the 76th generation. It's here. It's real. Lord knows it's a beautiful state.
Right.
The most demonized state in the world, but a beautiful state, a democratic state, an open state, a pluralistic state. With flaws? You bet. Look at the driving. And not every decision made is a perfect decision.
Right.
But Israel has a right to live, to thrive, to contribute, to defend itself. And I may not live in Israel, a decision I'm going to think about for the rest of my life, but I'm going to do whatever I can and encourage my family to do whatever they can to ensure that we're not just bystanders in the bleachers, we're doing something to help Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship.
You know, David, you may not live in Israel, but you definitely live and breathe Israel. And I completely agree with you that we live in a fortunate generation where we get to be the ones fighting for a strong and viable and progressive and unbelievable, miraculous state of Israel.
Miraculous, that's the word.
The only complaint I always have at the end of our conversations is I feel it's just the beginning. I really would have loved to go on and discuss so much more with you because things are happening all around us. But I'm taking with me from this show again that sense of activism, that we hear so much from you, we learn so much from you, and it's time to do something with it rather than just absorb, but rather make your voices heard. Our viewers, you've listened, you heard David, use your opportunity. Make your voices heard. Make sure that you use the power that you have to make a difference. That's the only way forward, David. I can't thank you enough.
Amen.
Amen. And like we always end, These are trying times for all of us, and the only way we can move forward is together.
Yachad.
Yachad.
Together.
Am Yisrael.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Chai. Always a pleasure. Thank you, David. And thank you, our viewers. May we see better times soon. Am Yisrael Chai.